Now, all over your body, you have sensory receptors for touch. And we'll get into that later. It doesn't matter what they're called. But on the end of this dendrite, there are these little gadgets, and the gadgets are sensitive to movement. They're sensitive to pressure. Because if you press down on the skin, you're depressing the skin. And as the skin moves, the little dendrites, I mean, the simplest ones just bend. And when a dendrite bends, it opens sodium channels. So, and of course, you know that starts the whole thing rolling. That's how, so you know, boom, sodium channels are opening, impulse comes up, and this is dendrite, 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 dendrite to body to axon, and that is how you get the information to the central nervous system, right? This is a peripheral neuron. By the way, both of these, the sensory and motor, they're going to be running in the same physical nerve. Remember that your nerves are mixed, not your tracts. And it's represented by the same thing, finger, dendrite, body, axon, and that's how you get to here. Now, your posterior gray horns are made out of the cell bodies and dendrites of your second order neurons. Now, these guys are multipolar, and the axon is going to run through that white commissure. Remember, you got your white and your gray commissure for side-to-side communication. Because what you feel with the left side is experienced with the right side of the brain. So that stuff has to cross over someplace. And then it's going to enter, or it's going to join this thing. This is an ascending tract. This is a spinothalamic tract. Now remember that this is going to be full, you know, there are millions of other axons from other levels of the spinal cord, but they're all going to the same place. They're all going here to the thalamus. The thalamus is, and that's why it's called a spinothalamic tract. It's an ascending tract. And remember the last time we did this thing, when we were talking about attack in the foot, the neuron was down here, but it's going to be joining the same ascending tract and going to the same place. What else is going on here? So the spinothalamic tract is going to run it, that's a second order neuron. This is a second order neuron, and it runs up to the thalamus, and the thalamus is your main sensory junction. That's where all the sensory information from the whole body is coming. All kinds of different stuff is going in there. And then the thalamus is going to sort it out. And it's going to say, oh, that's tactile information. Now that I have a brain here, tactile actually goes to this purple strip right here. This is the part of your body that feels, or I should say the part of your brain that experiences feel. And every part of the body, actually, and the body is upside down, like the feet are sort of dangling down here into the longitudinal fissure, and your butt's over here, and your trunk is over here, and this whole big section is just the face and the hands. Face and the hands have a lot of real estate on the brain because the face and the hands are very sensitive. Basically, half of the sensory cortex is just taken off by this part of your body, and the entire rest of your body is crammed onto the other end. It's just not as sensitive. Anyway, so that's going to go up here, and by the way, if there was visual information coming in here from the optic nerve, that would be sent here, because that's your visual center. If it was auditory information for your ears, it would go here. So the thalamus is going to shoot that all over the place. There are these things called the corona radiata. It's a beautiful name for all the tracts that are coming out of the thalamus, because basically, just going to do it in green, the thalamus is sending things here and here and here and here, all those third order neurons, to plug into the part of the brain that specializes in that kind of sensation. One of the things that really makes us different, and I don't mean different from animals, but different, you know, more sophisticated, is going to be our tremendous ability to figure out different sensory information and, you know, what to do with it. So that's your sensory pathway, and that's how you become aware of what's going on in your outside world. Brain is in a box. Brain doesn't know a thing unless the peripheral nervous system tells it what's going on. And by the way, then the brain ignores half of the information and then makes up stuff that isn't even there, because it's a pattern that we're used to. And you know, the brain, remember, the brain is expensive to run, so it's always looking to save energy. And one way to save energy is by not paying attention, which is why really your mind tends to drift, right? You're starting in the beginning of the lecture and you're there, but it's like after a while it's like, oh my God, it's like being on the ropes. It's hard to do. And so what we do is we peripherally scan things. We can usually find a pattern that fits into, and then we go on to the next thing. And that's brain finding a pattern. But back to the mundane, the wiring. First order, second order, and then third order. So let me see what else this is with this. Now notice another thing, that the sensory linkage crosses over inside the spinal cord. That's why left hand is felt with the right side of the brain, but the motor does not. There's your motor tract, and it's right next to the anterior great horn on the same side. That's because the pyramidal tracts cross over in the brain. So the left side of the brain still controls the right hand, but the crossover doesn't take place in the cord, it takes place in the brain. And most people are right-handed because for most people the left side of the brain is dominant. If you are left-handed, the right side of the brain is more dominant. So, now a couple of things I want to point out on these slides. So, last time we were having all the linkage go down through the lower part of the cord because this is the sciatic nerve right here. And the sciatic nerve, those neurons go into the corda equina and they end up going into the lower part of the cord. That's where all the synapses are to control the lower extremities, both motor and sensory. Today, we were up here because here you are, the arms are going to be controlled by this. And this is see, the spinal nerves come out and they form a network. And that's called a plexus. Plexus just means network. And then all of the terminal nerves, the nerves with names, the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, the sciatic nerve, they come out of one of these plexuses. And there's our corda equina again. Let's see. Remember that a nerve, you got a big motor cable made out of many motor neurons, big sensory cable, and then you've got a big autonomic cable. We haven't done that part yet. These are the tracks, right? So there's your dorsal root ganglia, so you know that this is mercifully the way that I drew it on the board. And so most of your sensory stuff is in the back, most of your motor stuff is in the front, but there are exceptions, of course. And you really want to come over to like these spinothalamic tracts. You're reaching all the way across, actually, so it snakes over, not exactly the way I draw it, because these are the cables that are going up. And let me see. This is the sensory pathway. Now, the way that I did it is true, but there are other ways to do it, but we're just going to stick with, believe it or not, it's more complicated than this. There are other ways that the sensory neurons can go, but they all basically go this way. So if you're looking at this one, here's your receptor, there's your dorsal root ganglion, this is your posterior roots coming into the posterior gray horn, and it's in this one over here, it's crossing just like I had it, and your neurons are going up. Now, you go straight to the brain in these drawings. This is the brain, but this is also sections of the brain. So they're not bothering with the rest of the cord. But up in the brain, you're going and you're going and you're going, and that's the thalamus right there. And in the thalamus, that's where your major linkage is, and that's where your third order neuron go into the cortex right over here. And the next, and it's in blue, because sensory is in blue. And then in red, we've got our motor pathway. This is the pyramidal tract. Pyramidal tract is coming down, 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 down. This is all brain, remember. And the low part of the brain where the tracts cross over is not shown. It's just so they kind of skip it. But there it is on the other side. And then it's coming to the anterior gray horn. The anterior gray horn is going out. Whoops, it's going out like that. So that's going to be your motor pathways. And then this is just going to be this is doing it nerve at a time, the actual linkage there. Questions on that? Breathe in. Breathe out.
Maybe you could go over what's first order, second order, third order?
In your sensory pathway, first order is the body to the cord. Second order is cord to brain. And third order is brain to brain. That basically
Wait, what's the green?
The
green is all
green,
this
oh,
what
the
they
green
said.
that I drew in was the corona radiata. That was just all of the
And
different
showing
things coming off
how
the thalamus,
they're connected.
because that's your sensory hub, and then once it's sorted out, it just goes to the different parts of the cerebrum that are specialists in
Gotcha.
analysis. Your thalamus does have a certain awareness, like when we're talking consciousness, but they call it thalamic awareness, which means basically you've just woken up, you haven't had your first cup of coffee, you're not in a particularly good mood, and you know that it's daylight. That's about the end of it, you know. And then you get up to the monkey brain over here, it's more sophisticated.
Gotcha.
Okay, so what?
Sophisticated monkey. Huh?
Well, they call the cerebrum the primate brain because the truth is all mammals have a cerebrum, but the primates really went off in that direction because again, this is very expensive, and so if you're going to add bells and whistles here, you need more calories, and that becomes a problem. Like the great apes eat 10 hours a day. They're just eating all the time because they're vegetarians. And most primates are not. Most primates are omnivores like us. But the great apes up in the forests up there, if you're just getting it all from vegetables, you basically got to eat all day long. And the other thing is there's a trade-off too. They've got all of these huge muscles, but their brains, even though it's the same basic design, are much smaller than ours. And scientists think it's just a trade-off. You can afford one or the other, but you can't afford both. Too many calories. So, now this is the spinothalamic tract, and remember that our sensory tracts are all named. The tracts that we have to worry about are all named by where they start and where they end. So, spinothalamic are going up. But there is another important tract I do want you to know. I'm just going to write it in here. There is the spinocerebellar tract. The spinocerebellar tract. So where does that go?
From the spine to the cerebellum?
Spine to the cerebellum. So it is also an ascending tract. It is also an ascending tract. And the thing is that the cerebellum handles coordination so that you can walk and talk and not fall over and things like that. But in order to do coordination, you need to know where all your parts are. Remember the exercise where we all touched our nose? That's coordination, right? So to do that, you need to know proprioception. So that's the information. It's sensory, but that's the information that's going through the spinocerebellar tract. It is proprioception. Proprioception.
It's all cerebellum.
It's going, yes, spinocerebellar tract is goes to cerebellum.
You asking for tours?
I was asking if that was an M or R or
CERR.
Cerebellar.
bellar.
Goes to the cerebellum.
Okay, not cerebellum. Okay.
No, well, yeah, this is one of those things. Okay, the name of the brain part is the cerebellum, but if you were referring to it in some way, you say cerebellar. It's one of those Latin things where the end of the name changes because of the way you're talking about it. Same thing with the thalamus, right? The name of it is the thalamus, but we talk about the spinothalamic tract. It's just one of those things you got to get used to. Everybody got that bit? Okay. I want to talk about another thing in the notes called and this is like a motor control thing. The final common pathway, the spinal nerve, is the final common sending tracks send info to it, if the spinal nerve is damaged, nothing gets to the effector. Nothing gets to the effector, and you have something called flaccid paralysis. Flaccid paralysis simply means that you got no power at all. It's like the muscle is just like dead. And you can think of this as like, you know, people who have spine injuries or something like that, or no, that's not a good example. People who have polio. Polio would be a good example of this. So polio, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, polio is a viral infection that infects the anterior gray horns, these motor neurons right here. So when we were drawing our motor pathways, we were drawing you know, coming from here, you're thinking about it, you're moving it down to here, and then you're going out. But there are many other motor pathways in the central nervous system. So just to mess around with this picture a little bit, truth is, right now, you are using your pyramidal tracts to write with, but you're not using your pyramidal tracts to sit with. That's coming from a different part of the brain. So you have other brain motor centers which are not in the cortex. There is the red nucleus, there is the pectum, you don't have to worry about all these right now. There is the extrapyramidal tracts, and they are all talking to this guy. But remember that this guy, the lower motor neuron, controls the skeletal muscles directly. That's the puppet master. So it's listening to all kinds of different things. So while you're thinking to write, you are also sending impulses down to keep your hips in a certain position, your back in a certain position, keep your head up so it doesn't fall over. You're not thinking about any of those things. Your muscle tone, that's coming from over here. Your posture is coming from over here. All that stuff. So see, there are many different tracts, a lot of different, see all these other ones that we didn't talk about, these are all motor tracts here. They're here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on each side, and we only talked about one. And the thing is, though, it doesn't matter. And this is also why sometimes when somebody has a stroke and they have motor loss, they can get a lot of it back, because what the brain can do is, if you've had damage, you know, stroke is going to be brain damage. Let's see that this control center was damaged, and you're all messed up. But with a lot of work, you can send more signals down through these, because your final common pathway is still okay. And a lot of times people get complete control back. It's a lot of work, but they can do it. Whereas if this one gets damaged, you're out of luck, because you can do whatever you want over here, and this is the way to get to this muscle. So flaccid paralysis. So basically flaccid paralysis. So, and that's, since it's the spinal nerve, this would be lower motor neuron damage. Now, fortunately, you can fix the lower motor neurons, right? You got the Schwann cells, and the Schwann cells will rebuild the neurolemma, and then you can grow right through. But, you know, that's only if the gods are favorable. You can get into all kinds of accidents where you have lacerations and you don't get it back because the doctors weren't able to line everything up, or scar tissue formed, or something else. But that's the basic thing with lower motor neuron damage.
Is this related to the toothbrush? That we're learning to brush our teeth with the other end?
Well, learning, I mean, the lower, let me fix that. The lower motor neuron is fine. It is kind of similar in that, but you don't have brain damage, hopefully. But the thing is that what you're doing, though, is you are using parts of the brain in a way that you've never used them before, and they have to figure it out. That's the learning process. And now we're about a week and a half into it. Those of you who stuck with it should be fairly fluid in it at this point. I was thinking of you guys this morning because I was in a very crowded train and I was working on my computer and I couldn't do it with the right hand because it would have like interfered with personal space with the person next to me, and I'm like typing with my left hand, which is not as good, but it is possible. I'm like, it's really good to be able to use both sides. Now that's lower motor neuron damage, which leads to flaccid paralysis, but it is also possible to have upper motor neuron damage, and that leads to spastic paralysis. Upper motor neuron damage, just going to throw it over here. Upper motor neuron damage usually leads to something called spastic paralysis. Things like Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, stroke. Somebody has a stroke. All of these things cause upper motor neuron damage, which means that some of these brain centers get messed with. And the problem that happens when you have this kind of thing is that it's a loss of inhibition. Remember where I said that, you know, as you're getting better with brushing your teeth, it's moving smoother, and that's because of restraint, right? And if you don't have that restraint, your movements tend to get real, you know, sort of jagged and jerky. And it's a long time ago now, but there was a movie, My Left Foot, with Daniel Day-Lewis, and it's a true story about a guy who was born with cerebral palsy, which is infantile paralysis. Basically, when he was born, the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck, and that caused brain damage. So then he had cerebral palsy, and you could see, you know, his actions were very, you know, jerky, and he could move, but not very well. So, and you see this with people with strokes. Their movements are very, very unstable because they don't have inhibition, they don't have control. So that's spastic paralysis. And when you get into pathology, massage approach to flaccid paralysis and spastic paralysis is a bit different. So we'll talk about that. Now, other things going on. Your pyramidal tracts, your upper motor neurons, they're tracts, but then you have a lot of other motor tracts that are not pyramidal tracts, and they're just collectively called the extrapyramidal tracts. So they're also motor, but they're not from the cortex. So this is all just sort of adding detail to the picture you already have. Extrapyramidal tracts are also motor, but not from the cortex. Also motor, but not from the cortex. So it is unconscious motor movements, like walking, posture, things like that. Muscle tone. Things that the muscles do that you don't really have to think about. And the naming system is still the same. They're still named from the part of the brain they're going to the spinal cord. So examples of these would be the rubrospinal tract and the tectospinal tract, which won't make that much sense to you, but the tectum is a part of the brain, and the red nucleus is a part of the brain, and we'll get to them. You don't have to worry about them now. Just know that they exist. Not every motor tract is for conscious movement. Now, Now, some other things about here. I've been routing everything through the ventral root over here, the anterior ramus over here. Now remember, a ramus is just a branch, but the spinal nerves, when the spinal nerve clears the intervertebral canal, it splits. And the front one is really, really big, and the back one is really, really small. So in this model over here, actually, this is the spinal nerve in position, so this is the dorsal. So that's the posterior ramus right there, that tiny little thing, and the one that looks like basically the main thing, that's the ventral root over there. So you see the difference in the size. And the reason for this big difference in the size is the big one has more stuff to do. It's powering more of the body. So just so you know, this posterior ramus, what the heck is this posterior ramus for? Posterior ramus is just for, it's going to be sensory and motor for 2 inches on each side of the spine. So it's going to be doing this little bit of real estate right here. All the sensory and motor between my fingers here. So it's like 2 inches, 1.5 inches on each side. So if somebody tickles your back, that's sensory information. That's going to come in the same way. If you want to move your erectus spinae or your multifidus or something like that, those commands have to go through there. Everything else is going through the ventral ramus, the upper and lower extremities, the whole trunk. So it has a lot more to do. So stay right there. So basically, if I were to draw it in, if you did want to move your erectus spinae or your multifidus or any of those guys, this is what it would look like. It would go like this, and it would wrap posterior, and it's going to go in that direction. So that's what that posterior ramus is for. And the same thing, if somebody has a feather on the back of your back, the sensory information would come in, and it'll go like this, and there's a different unipolar neuron over there, and that's going to be handling that. So really they're the same, it's just a matter of the anterior ramus does a lot more. The anterior ramus is for the arms, the legs, and the trunk, except for that little bit. So obviously the anterior ramus has a lot more to do. And that is represented by this picture here. This one has it a little bit. There's your ventral ramus, there's your dorsal ramus. And again, they'll say ventral and dorsal or anterior, posterior, depending on who's talking to you. That's just sensory and motor. Here we go. Well, here's a little bit of it. So this would be there's the dorsal root in the back, there's the ventral root, there's the spinal nerve, there's the anterior ramus, and there's the posterior ramus. And here it is over here too. So there's your spinal cord, and there is your anterior ramus going to the body, but that's also going to be for the arms and the legs. And there's your posterior ramus going up through the multifidus and rotatories and finally erectus spinae. And the last thing in this drawing, the last thing that I did not do is that we didn't talk about this guy, and this guy is the autonomic linkage, right? The autonomic nervous system. So I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to let you go for a break. I'm going to do them in green because I'm running out of colors. But for this one, we have to add a knob, and that knob is a ganglion. Now remember that a ganglion is a cluster of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So besides everything else that's already here, there's one more thing. Sticking off the side over here is this little sympathetic chain ganglia. And this thing is the sympathetic chain ganglia. Now, obviously, as the name implies, it's for the sympathetic nervous system. So, what's really going to happen is your lateral gray horn is made out of the soma of your autonomic ganglia, and that goes out with all the other motor stuff, because remember, the autonomic nervous system is a motor system. It's a motor for the heart, the blood vessels, and stuff like that. And it goes through the spinal nerve, and it goes through this guy right here to get to here. And this little branch over here, I'm going to put a W there because it is the white rami communicans, which I'll write in a moment. And then we have a synapse, and the postganglionic one goes back to the spinal nerve and goes to the effector by the gray rami communicans. So, first things first. The way I've drawn it, which one is the presynaptic and which one is the postsynaptic neuron? Which is the presynaptic? B is the presynaptic because it's going into the synapse. A is the postsynaptic, right? But you know you never see these neurons alone. You see them in gangs, and a gang is a ganglia. So if you have a whole bunch of cell bodies, then you have a whole bunch of neurons here, and this thing is the sympathetic chain ganglion. A ganglion is a cluster of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. It's got stuff coming out of it. And that means it's got a lot of stuff coming into it. And this is going to be the lateral gray horn. So we call these I'm going to take the A and the B off because that's going to be confusing. We call these the preganglionic fibers, and we call these the postganglionic fibers. So it's the same basic deal as presynaptic and postsynaptic, but this is reflecting the fact that it's not one neuron, it's going to be a whole bundle of them. So, the autonomic pathway. The autonomic pathway is the lateral gray horn is the soma of sympathetic preganglionic neurons. Their axons go through the ventral root and the white rami communicans to the sympathetic chain so that's why I labeled that W. W for white. And remember, a ramus is just a branch. Communicans means communicating. It is the white communicating branch. And there is also a gray communicating branch. But we've only gotten here. We've got to the sympathetic chain ganglia. So your autonomic pathway, the lateral gray horn, is made out of cell bodies and dendrites of sympathetic preganglionic neurons, the axons of which go through the ventral root, the spinal nerve, and the white rami communicans into the sympathetic chain ganglia. The sympathetic chain ganglia is made of sympathetic postganglionic neurons whose axons go through the gray rami communicans to the spinal nerve and to the effector. And what are the effectors going to be? Smooth muscle, gland, the heart, that kind of thing. And there is a picture. There are some pictures of the sympathetic chain ganglia in your slides as well. That would be this picture right here. Well, this is it here. There's your rami communicans. They're also called rami communicans. Of course. There's the sympathetic chain ganglia right there.
You just told.
Now this one is a huge picture for you because this picture is upside down, right? This is the dorsal root ganglia on the bottom, which means the sympathetic chain is actually anterior. There's the body of the vertebra. Always got to keep track of that. Now, I mean, here's one of them. This is, again, you're coming up. Now, the reason it's called a sympathetic chain is because there's a chain of them. There are 22 on each side. So each one is connected to the spinal nerve at that segment, but it's also attached to the one below it and one below it. So each time you have a spinal nerve coming off, you've got a sympathetic chain, and it's attached, and it's attached, and it's attached. So if you look at the whole thing, it looks like a chain going all the way down. This is a picture with the heart removed, but the spinal cord is inside the spinal column. You can't see it in this picture. But these are also, this is the sympathetic chain going off to the side. So in this pathway, you're going from the lateral, gray horn, through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, through the gray rami communicans, and then you get in here, and you can synapse and return to the spinal cord and go on your merry way. There are other things you can do, but we're going to stop with that for now, which I know is not much. Okay. So, see what I mean? The autonomic nervous system and the brainstem are working just fine. Heart rate, blood pressure, all of that is being taken care of, even though your higher brain is completely overloaded at this point and just wants to cry. But the thing is, when you're trying to figure this stuff out, it's one piece at a time. First, first draw the apple, then draw the different things, and you add more and more. If the problem with multiple choices, it's asking you for some topic that's like completely unrelated to anything else. It's not in front of you. That's why doing it like this is better. And when you're taking your test on Wednesday, there'll be scrap paper, or you bring scrap paper. You can just draw this whole picture, and you really need to, because otherwise you're going to get confused. You're confused right now because you just learned it, but I mean, hopefully by now you know your motor pathway, you know your sensory pathway. You got one more pathway here. You got the autonomic pathway, which is similar to motor. It starts there. It still wraps through the ventral root. All motor goes through the ventral root, goes to the spinal nerve. It's just got this extra doodad here, the white communicant, to get to its linkage. It has to everybody's got a synapse someplace. So that synapse is here, and then goes back to the spinal nerve and on its merry way. So that's and the rest of the stuff that I just added in is just, you got pyramidal tracts, you got extrapyramidal tracts. Those are just details to remember. So we'll take a break. We'll come back at 5 after.